The Pimax Crystal Super has a bunch of things going for it, like stupidly good image quality and interchangeable optical engines. What I have here are the ultra-wide QLED engine and the new OLED engine, which has a narrower field of view, but possibly the most vivid and sharp image I've ever seen. But then there's the Steam frame looming on the horizon. It's wireless and has the promise of Valve magic attached to it. On paper, these two headsets couldn't be more different, yet they actually share a key feature that plays a completely different role in how each of them performs. With more and more VR headsets appearing on the market, the most common question gets even more complicated. Which one should you get? Why not just get a Quest 3 that everyone loves so much and be happy with it? Or an even more affordable Pico 4? We'll go into all of that in a minute. I'm Mish, this is the Crystal Super. Let's answer all of these questions. Pimax sent me this Crystal Super for review. It's going back to them once I'm done testing. They have no editorial influence whatsoever on this video, and I only take sponsorings that give me full freedom in what I say. An affiliate discount link is in the description down there. Let's start with the ultra-wide QLED engine. It has 140 degrees of horizontal field of view and a combined horizontal resolution of 7680 pixels. This means it sits at the very top end of consumer headsets. I got it because I think VR can't have enough field of view. Most headsets still suffer from that diver goggles effect, and that's something we really need to get rid of. After unboxing, connecting and updating everything, which took around 10 minutes and went through without any issues, I jumped straight into MechWarrior 5 VR. Don't worry, we'll cover flight sims later as well. At 100% resolution, my 5080 is pretty close to exploding, but the wide FOV looks fantastic. Pimax says it's around 140 degrees horizontally, and it absolutely shows. I felt more immersed immediately because I can almost see the mech's shoulders while looking straight ahead. Hey, Editing Mish here. It seems it's almost impossible to capture sharp footage directly through the lens, especially with the QLED ultra-wide. It's easier though, somehow, in MechWarrior 5 than it is in IL-2 or in Star Citizen, for example. The footage you see through the lens in this video, take it with a grain of salt and at least double the sharpness. Also, the FOV isn't that wide as it would be because I'm limited by the lens I'm using, of course. But you can get an idea about the general image quality. So with that said, let's continue. Next up was IL-2 Great Battles, and the effect was very similar. The wider field of view makes everything feel way more immersive. I actually caught myself flying over different theaters and locations just to look at things. There are some trade-offs though. First, edge-to-edge clarity does suffer a bit, and you get some fringing toward the outer edges of the field of view. That's not surprising at 140 degrees with aspheric lenses, but overall they still do a super good job. Some glare is visible in high contrast scenes, but it's mostly acceptable and still a lot better than what we've seen on previous generation headsets and lenses. Stereo overlap is also reduced because of the display positioning. Both eyes see roughly 65% of the image, which can make the result feel a bit flatter compared to headsets with higher overlap. But that's all complaining at a pretty high level. Compared to older headsets like the Reverb G2 or the Quest 2, the edge-to-edge clarity here is still on a completely different level. It's not even close. And about my exploding 5080, reducing render resolution somehow works better on these high-resolution headsets than it does on something like my Pico 4. On the Pico, everything below native resolution quickly looks super blurry. Here, if I set the resolution to roughly the native resolution of the Pico 4 in MechWarrior 5, the image still looks significantly better. I guess the lenses and the interpolation are doing some heavy lifting here. Another thing is the HUD elements remain rendered at native resolution, which makes a huge difference. They look crisp and sharp, and that adds a lot to the overall vibe of each game. After that, I tried the OLED module. Swapping modules takes about 30 seconds. Remove the gasket, unlock and pull out the ultra-wide module, slot in the OLED module, done. The headset doesn't even need to reboot. It also has a combined horizontal resolution of 7680 pixels, but a little bit less vertical with 3552 pixels compared to the 3840 of the ultra-wide module. Less resolution means less strain on your GPU though, and it's 100 grams lighter than the ultra-wide engine. Same procedure as before, I started with MechWarrior 5 and holy crap, the colors really pop. I actually caught myself making excited noises alone at home while looking around the mech hangar for the first time. That doesn't happen very often. Instead of IL-2, I tried Star Citizen VR and it also just looks incredible. I couldn't stop walking around my ship and testing them out one after the other, completely losing track of time. The OLED's pancake lenses have significantly more stereo overlap, roughly 95% compared to about 65% on the QLED ultra-wide. That alone improves depth perception noticeably. Combined with the deep blacks and vivid colors, HUD elements separate much more clearly from the cockpit and the landscape behind them. What you end up with is a stupidly sharp and vivid image that has a lot less fringing compared to the Crystal Light, for example. This is the sharpest and overall the best image I've personally ever seen in a VR headset. And I'm not exaggerating here. That includes the Quest 2, Reverb G2, Pico 4 and the Crystal Light. It's not even close. So the obvious question is, how does this compare to other high-end headsets like the Big Screen Beyond 2E, and why did I bring up the Steam frame earlier? Let's start with the idea that large bulky headsets are dead, which you hear quite often. Well, you know, there are roughly 3 categories right now: small, medium and large headsets. And still for good reason. The Big Screen Beyond 2 and the upcoming Pimax Dream Air fall into the small category. Headsets like the Steam Frame and Pico 4 sit more in the middle, and the Crystal Super clearly belongs to large. Each of these form factors comes with different advantages and trade-offs. Small is obviously small and light, but you also have less thermal headroom. And with micro OLED plus pancake optics, brightness can be more limited than on larger designs that can push higher sustained luminance. Many of the really small headsets also stay small by offloading compute and power to the PC, so they are typically tethered over DisplayPort or USB rather than trying to carry a battery and full standalone CPU and GPU. Very wide fields of view are also harder to achieve in a compact footprint because you have less room for large optics and panel positioning. And you have fewer options for inside-out tracking because cameras, compute and power all take space and generate heat. That is, for example, why Big Screen went with Steam VR base station tracking, which avoids having to build an inside-out camera system into a tiny shell. Medium sits right in the middle, with more space for larger lenses and screens, which gives you more headroom for field of view and brightness. And there's enough room to integrate multi-camera inside-out tracking and batteries for true wireless standalone operation. Large headsets like the Pimax Super, on the other hand, can go all in on brightness and field of view with bigger optics and displays. And they also have room for extras like large active cooling solutions and shenanigans like swappable optical modules. The true feel of a headset goes beyond specs though. Big Screen Beyond 2E and Pimax Dream Air headsets aren't small just for the sake of being small. The idea is to keep the hardware as much out of the way as possible. A large headset constantly reminds you that you're wearing something on your face, simply because of its mass and volume. Very small or very balanced headsets like the Pico 4 with its rear battery tend to fade into the background much more easily over time. That doesn't necessarily mean they disappear, but your brain stops paying attention to them as much. On top of that, smaller and lighter headsets are easier to stow away and generally less of a commitment to use, which I think matters more than people like to admit once the novelty wears off. Large headsets, on the other hand, also aren't just large for the sake of being large. That extra volume buys you design freedom. You get more room for bigger lenses, larger displays, higher sustained brightness, wider fields of view, and better cooling. It also opens the door for things you simply can't do in a tiny shell, like swappable optical modules. The trade-off is obvious: more weight and more presence on your face. You're always aware that the headset is there, but in return you get a kind of visual performance and flexibility that smaller designs just can't offer yet. As I already said, and I'm not alone here, the Pimax Crystal Super OLED module gives the best image quality I've personally tested so far. Other reviewers with more experience with high-end headsets had a similar impression.
Man, I gotta say, in terms of raw image quality, I have never seen anything like this.
They are the best VR visuals you can get. They beat the pants off anything.
What it ultimately comes down to is what you value more: immersion through comfort or immersion through image quality. That's really the core difference between something like the Pimax Crystal Super and a headset like the Big Screen Beyond 2E. The Pimax Dream Air could lessen the gap since it uses the same resolution and lenses as the Pimax Super OLED, but it comes at a premium price of $1,899 at release. The Dream Air SE is cheaper at $899, but it has less resolution, which might be an advantage in certain scenarios though. More on that later. So now the question is, where does the Steam frame fit into all of this? It obviously is going to be a lot cheaper and a lot smaller than the Pimax Crystal Super. Both have eye tracking though, and that's the big common denominator. The important part is that the intent between integrating it is different for each device. Dynamic foveated rendering, meaning the headset tracks your eyes and only renders what you're actually looking at in full resolution. This can increase performance a lot in DCS, for example. This is called eye-track quad-views foveated rendering, and it's in a completely different league compared to the VRS-based foveated rendering. VRS, or variable rate shading, works by shading less detail in the peripheral parts of the image, but it still renders the full scene geometry everywhere. Because of that, the gains are mostly modest. Quad views goes a step further by actually rendering multiple view regions at different resolutions, so far less work is done outside your focal area. That's why quad views commonly delivers roughly 20 to 50% more GPU headroom, and in some extreme GPU bound cases it can even get close to a frame rate doubling until you run into a CPU limit, which happens a lot in VR. For the Crystal Super, this means its extremely high per eye resolution suddenly becomes realistic on a CPU below a 5090, which already struggles quite a bit without it. For the Steam frame though, which has roughly 1/3 of the per eye pixel count of the Crystal Super's OLED module, dynamic foveated rendering pushes it even further into the mainstream performance range. A 5070, for example, is already capable of delivering acceptable frame rates on a Quest 3 or Pico 4, which sit in the same resolution class. With proper eye-tracked foveated rendering, the Steam frame could be able to pull ahead noticeably. The catch is that proper quad views foveated rendering has to be integrated by the game developers themselves. It's not something that a headset manufacturer can just force on the game from the outside. Quad views changes how the engine renders the scene, how views are split up, and how resolution is allocated across those views. That requires deep engine level support. Headset makers can provide the eye tracking data and the APIs, but unless the game actually implements quad views properly, you won't get those big gains. That's why it works so well in something like DCS, where the developers went all in on it, but it can't be applied universally across all VR titles the way simpler techniques like VRS can. That leaves us with the following conclusion. If you want something that works well for both seated and standing VR, the Steam frame is an interesting option, especially if dynamic foveated rendering gets properly integrated into more games. In that case, mid-range GPUs should be able to handle it quite well, while the high-end headsets I mentioned really demand a high-end card. But the Steam frame isn't going to be as cheap as a Quest 3 or Pico 4, and in my opinion, it could end up much closer in price to something like a Pimax Dream Air SE than a lot of people expect. One more thing to also note is that the Steam frame uses LCD panels, not OLED. That means blacks and colors won't pop quite as much. It's a reasonable choice though, because at the Steam frame's lower resolution, the screen door effect is less pronounced on LCD than it would be on OLED. And it keeps the price in check. So that, together with your main use case, is worth keeping in mind if you're thinking about waiting for the next wave of headsets. If you're all about performance, comfort and mixed VR, seated and standing, I'd wait for a Steam frame instead of pulling the trigger on anything else right now. Its construction is close to the Pico 4, which should make it a pretty balanced and comfortable headset. If you're mostly into simulations, meaning seated VR, and you want the best visual fidelity you can realistically get today, the Pimax Crystal Super OLED is, in my opinion, the prime contender. If you want to maximize FOV, the ultra-wide module is what you want. It's great as well. The headset is large and bulky though. That's simply the price we have to pay at the moment for this level of image quality. I'd also recommend getting the DMAS speakers because the built-in speakers do their job but aren't great by any means. If convenience is more important to you and you're mainly doing seated VR, a smaller cable-bound headset like the upcoming Dream Air and Dream Air SE can be the better choice. Especially the SE in my opinion, since it uses 2560 x 2560 OLED displays, which for many setups are a pretty good sweet spot right now. The resolution is high enough that the screen door effect is essentially gone, meaning you no longer see the gaps between pixels as a visible grid, but still low enough that you don't immediately melt your GPU just by launching Beat Saber. If you want a small OLED headset, right now the Big Screen Beyond 2E is an option, but it relies on external base station and that extra hardware definitely shows up on the final bill. The last thing worth considering is that the Crystal Super's optical modules are interchangeable. Pimax made official statements positioning it as a platform meant to evolve. So, as displays and optic technology improves, there's a realistic chance you can keep the headset itself and upgrade it later by slotting in an improved top-end module in late 2026 or 2027, which would be quite convenient. If you're in the market for one of these, feel free to use my discounted affiliate link in the description. You'll get 2% off the Super and the Crystal Lite. There also is the Golden Bundle, which includes both the ultra-wide and the OLED optical engine. Using the link helps keep the channel going and I'd really appreciate that. Thanks for stopping by, fly safe, and I'll see you in the next one.